What is up, everybody? Welcome to the final cash game review show of the season, going over week 17. As always, I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 444.com. As always, with my co host, Matt Savoca. Matt, happy week 18. Happy end of the cash game review season for us. How was your week?
It's a weird Twilight Zone, right? Like, what is week 18? I don't know what's going on, but it was a good week. I'm really happy to finish out this show for this year with a bang like this. Obviously there's always a little bit of luck involved, a little bit of positive variance, but 92nd percentile without Jamar Chase in the lineup, 3x my entry fees, one of the best weeks of the year, and this is one of those weeks where we talk about the fundamentals of making sure you're in triple ups and quintuple ups. I don't think there are any 10xers on FanDuel. So I was able, to make much more than a typical cash week this week. Not going to have weeks like that every week, but happy to end strong here.
Yeah, hopefully people are following that advice all year that if you were, throw your cash game in a small tournament or multipliers, you don't necessarily have to be over 500 on the season in terms of number of weeks you win, because on those weeks that you do hit, they'll make up for quite a few bad weeks actually. So really good. Let's jump into the lineup and talk about your build on FanDuel this week, starting with your hits and your locks. Lots of hits on there, but let's talk about kind of where you started with your lineup.
Sure. This wasn't necessarily the easiest week to do it, but once I saw that Trey Lance was really popping in our value rankings, I decided that my anchor point was going to be the trio of Kupp, Jonathan Taylor, and Trey Lance. And to be completely honest, we've had easier weeks in terms of free square values to get to the two premium players. But when you looked at the comparison in the skill positions of Kupp and Taylor compared to the rest of the field, I just felt like it was incredibly murky after that top two. So why not just take the value play at quarterback against a bad Houston defense that overperformed last week, and then just go with Kupp and Taylor, figure it out from there. So Berrios was an obvious value play. Singletary was an obvious value play. And then I kind of jammed in David Montgomery once I found out that Cortland Sutton was available. Not my favorite play. We got two 5,300 receivers, but Singletary, Montgomery, and those anchor points really led the way, along with Berrios.
Yeah, I like the idea of jamming in Jonathan Taylor a lot. I think people that were able to do that late in the process in the week were rewarded. I mean, 18 FanDuel points, he's not blowing the doors off or anything, but by the time we got kickoff, we found out Carson Wentz was playing, they still didn't play that good, but and then got an offensive lineman back, so they weren't completely depleted. I think it made sense to jam him in, but then I think it was a very obvious 3 running back build a week. I just didn't think there was any way we were going for wide receivers, especially with all of the value that we had at running back. And with us, I think probably you were starting with Cooper Kupp. Like that was our kind of lock across the board. So it was just to pay for 3 more receivers was pretty tough to do. Talk to me a little bit about Singletary specifically, because I think Montgomery was in a fantastic spot, but then we had a few other running backs that were decent values. So what pushed you to Singletary over some of the other guys?
So the first part was just the game environment that he was supposed to be in, playing the Atlanta Falcons, and you're a huge favorite. And honestly, the game flow doesn't go as well as I would have thought. But we're at the point now over the last 3 games where Devin Singletary is, dare I say, running away with the backfield here. The touches aren't even close. And one of the big things, we actually, it didn't run very hot in the beginning. Josh Allen had 2 rushing touchdowns. So all that talk about Devin Singletary getting more goal line usage and Josh Allen kind of moving away from that role, that's kind of BS. Like he runs 2 in the first quarter, I believe, or at least the first half. Anyway, Singletary gets there in the second half as they're putting that game away, and we get the usage we want. 23 carries, 110 yards, and the 2 touchdowns. Yeah, that works out even better than expected, but it was kind of great from a late swap standpoint because those hit late, and it let me rest easy from a late swap perspective.
Yeah, no, it was great, and going with that with that kind of high-low build with Singletary and Jonathan Taylor. I mean, you mentioned like we have to get lucky sometimes. I think your build's super sharp, but also just avoiding that Rojo landmine was huge because he was a top 3 value in our running back projections on FanDuel. So avoiding that was really good for you. And after those guys, I mean, would you say you would consider Braxton Berrios one of your locks? So it kind of leaves you with what, like Sutton and Ertz, and were kind of the only spots you were playing with in defense. So what was the process there? I actually like the Sutton play a lot.
Yeah, so that one was my hardest pick for sure. Obviously, when you're going with 2 wide receivers at 5,300, you're dealing with a ton of uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
But from a value compared to salary-based expectations standpoint, Barrios was the best play at his salary range according to our value metrics.
Yeah.
So that one was kind of easy, actually.
Yep.
And then Ertz was the second easiest, simply because he was going to be super popular. If I'm looking at the big double up with 16,000 people in it, he was 56% owned. We've talked about it plenty of times where at that point, we're just going to take that and differentiate our lineups elsewhere.
Yep.
So finally, you're dealing with Courtland Sutton, who became a much, much more interesting play once Jerry Jeudy was ruled out. I know you could have played Noah Fant there. And again, that doesn't even run very hot, only catches 3 passes. Drew Lock spends time in the locker room. It wasn't pretty necessarily, but we'll take 7.5 points, or should I say really 30 points from our 2 5,300 wide receivers all day, every day.
Absolutely, yeah. One thing that I think is very interesting about your lineup, I mentioned Rojo. You had no Buccaneers in your lineup. AB was expensive. Obviously, we got news that Mike Evans was going to be playing in limited capacity. I think we had talked a little bit about Gronk on our Friday show. So, did you have any any worries about fading the Bucs, or was it kind of just come down to salary and value, and they just weren't even fitting in, so it didn't matter?
It's more the latter. I love Tampa Bay stacks in tournaments. I was talking up Gronk all weekend long, and that obviously works out. AB was also kind of salary prohibitive on FanDuel. You really didn't need to get to him. I think Tyreek was actually cheaper in salary.
Yeah, So I didn't think people were going to be forcing in AB by any means, especially once we got news that Mike Evans was going to play, even though it was in a slightly limited role. But overall, just a great lineup. Did you ever think about trying to force in any of the more expensive defenses? Obviously, it would have been a big switch from the Colts, but we had so many defenses and crazy smash spots. Or was it just get those skill players you want and then just kind of hope the Colts get enough?
I mean, we had a couple of decent value defenses this week, and on DraftKings it was all like one. Maybe there was one that had a 2.0 or something like that, but ultimately I felt like the value was pointing me to, dare I say, defense doesn't matter, and so I just correlated it with Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah,
moved on with my day.
I like that a lot. Again, it's always interesting how cash works, and if you are kind of just following these principles, that you can have a week like yesterday where you finish above the 90th percentile without the highest score on the slate, just because he wasn't really popping as a value, Jamar Chase, but definitely were some Chase lineups out there. What else did you notice besides Chase lineups that really hit in cash games besides yours?
Rashad Penny, man. Yeah. I mean, you played anybody in that Seattle games, or if you stacked Russell Wilson with DK Metcalf, ran it back with Amon-Ra St. Brown, you had a nice afternoon. Obviously, Devin Singletary worked well. We had a bunch of the high-profile quarterbacks hit their value. TB12, Russ, Dak, all hit 3x value. Josh Allen at a super high salary hits 2.7x. That's fantastic for cash games, so he didn't hurt you if you went that direction. And obviously, Barrios was identified as a value play across the DFS industry, but when a player like that hits 4x, he's actually the player that kills you if you don't have him. Because everyone else getting him at 5,300, there's a lot of mistakes you can make once Barrios hits at that level. And so the other things I noticed, like Darrell Williams also hit 4x. He was definitely someone I was trying to fit in later on in the week. Ramondre Stevenson was not cash viable. He hits 4x, and I wasn't really looking at Boston Scott, but he had a big day too.
Yeah, that's a really good point about Barrios. Like, and we mentioned like you can whiff on a Jamar Chase, 40 whatever points, and still do very well in cash games if you don't have like the obvious value, not even just like a good value, but a very affordable value, a cheap value. It's going to have a huge cascading effect. Like the lineups that have that value and then have their other players hitting, like you're just never catching them. If you're trying to fade those types of values in cash games, it's just never, very rarely going to be a good day for you when it hits.
What's funny is that I switched off of Michael Carter to Barrios at 12:51 p.m. That's
Nice.
usually a minus EV move, but this week
Yeah.
it went all right.
Yeah, those ones never feel like they go the right way. I had a couple of those yesterday. Any last thoughts on FanDuel?
No, not really. There were actually a lot. The value ranking once again came through for us, but there were a lot of outs that we had this week. I hope you guys, if you've been listening to the show, had a good week on FanDuel as well.
Yeah, definitely. Let's hop on over to DraftKings, where we did not have a 90th percentile week. 30th percentile. Left licking my wounds a little bit on this one. I mentioned the Buccaneers. I mean, the two landmines, the two biggest landmines, Rojo and Antonio Brown. We all saw what happened with AB, and then Rojo gets hurt, and then that game just didn't even game script anywhere close to how we expected it to. So those are the two ones that really hurt me a ton. Still not like I don't hate the build. I mean, if you excuse me, if you look at the ownership percentages on the players I have, all of mostly the most popular players on the slate between 25% and 55% owned in cash games. So my build this week was these three running backs, Rojo, Sony, and David Montgomery, were pretty much who I was playing all week. Obviously, I wrote up Jonathan Taylor and Josh Jacobs. I didn't write up Devin Singletary just because I thought with all these other running backs in the same salary range that you didn't need to take the risk on him potentially losing touchdowns to Josh Allen, and just the way that running back position has typically played out. I thought that really like the last 2 weeks were his ceiling. Obviously, I was wrong about that, but I was kind of always going with these three running backs in Cooper Kupp and then building around there. The only other player that I added to the running back player pool was when we finally got news that CH was officially out. I added Darrell Williams in, but I was never really going to. I don't think I was going to get him over any of these three guys. So it was pretty much those three and Cup for me, and then kind of build around there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and you can see, you're kind of rolling with ownership here. It almost looks like you optimize this lineup by projected ownership, and then just tried to differentiate in a couple places, which is one of the strategies we talk about all the time. Even players that don't hit here, like Ronald Jones at 30, a third of the lineups here had Ronald Jones, so. That's not a score that kills you. Obviously, you get a couple snowflakes, you get a 0 on defense. You run cold some weeks, but from a lineup build standpoint, there's nothing here that sticks out as egregious.
Yeah, the 0 from the Dolphins hurt. They've been just getting pressure at such a good rate, and their defense has just been a good, real defense. I mean, obviously a road underdog isn't an ideal situation, but down at that salary, able to fit these other guys in, I was pretty happy about it. So the thing that it was actually kind of ended up being kind of a weird week by the time lock happened with Jared Cook landing on the COVID list. It was actually kind of difficult to decide who the cheap plays were going to be. Steven Anderson, Trey Lance. I was pretty locked in on Barrios. Like I wasn't wavering off him too much, so I guess you could consider him a lock play. But it was the thing for Trey Lance for me on DraftKings is, even though he was so cheap and he was our top value on 4for4 at quarterback, with my player pool, with all of the guys that I thought were cash viable, he actually wasn't popping in the optimizer. He was actually a little bit down the list. So builds where you were able to get up to Dak, Stafford, even Mahomes, those were projecting for more points. by a pretty significant margin. So kind of the thought process here was like, well, if I can get Dak in this or any of the other quarterback stacks, the one that ended up fitting in these kind of smash spots, and I could punt Steven Anderson, a position that's way, that is more volatile and I'm more comfortable punting than quarterback, I'm going to make that decision. Obviously, really doesn't work out with Anderson. He just doesn't do anything. And then that kind of naturally puts me on the Dolphins defense, where I think an alternative build where I go all the way down to Lance probably gets me to a little more expensive defense, which might save me a couple points. A different tight end, a different defense obviously is better here, but I don't know if it lets me recover from Antonio and Rojo. Like, I think I'm kind of dead in the water either way.
I think that's fair. I think one critique I might add is that with Steven Anderson, he obviously fits as a value play. You see a ton
Yeah.
of players playing him. A quarter of lineups have him, but I feel like this slate had so many great tight ends
Yeah.
that somebody was going to beat me if
Yeah,
I
for
didn't
sure.
have one of them. At least like Zach Ertz had that 10 target upside. He gets 7 receptions for 41. That's kind of a floor performance. But by going to, I get it. By going to Anderson, you're also kind of saying that Kelsey, Kittle, Andrews, Ertz, they all
Yeah.
don't have scores that kill you in cash.
Yeah, not getting to Ertz is probably my biggest regret of the slate, just because getting to Kelsey or Andrews, even though Andrews didn't do much, but like he was the consideration. It just kind of would have made it would have been too much of a force on DraftKings. Kelsey all the
Yeah.
way up at 73. It was just really hard to fit that in. Excuse me, but Ertz was just such a good play all week. One that I wrote up, one that like the target share was so obvious. I think I just got a little over enamored with the Steven Anderson 2,500 price tag. That's probably the biggest change that I make was Ertz, especially because like even though Trey Lance wasn't popping in the optimals, like he was a lot better value, and they were all kind of bunched together in terms of that value, those top 3 or 4 quarterbacks that I had. So yeah, in retrospect, I think not getting to Ertz was probably the biggest flaw.
Yeah, still a solid lineup. We're talking about splitting
Yeah,
hairs here.
no,
Things go wrong
yeah,
sometimes.
things go wrong. You're when one of your best values retires mid game. That's you're gonna lose. It's like that you that's the football god saying this isn't your week. But looking at the lineups that did do well, I mean, joking aside, I mean, AB was in so many lineups that a lot of people survived him. All of the lineups that were obviously Singletary over Rojo, those lineups obviously do very well. A lot of pay up for defense lineups that we already talked about, the tight end. One thing that I never really considered on DraftKings, again, just because of the way the salaries are working this week, we're jamming in Cup with Jonathan Taylor. And again, Taylor doesn't have a monster game, but the way the salaries worked out, the teams that did force in those builds actually ended up having really good weeks. So getting to Taylor was a way to have a really good lineup.
Yeah, and that's such a big differentiator from cash games and tournaments, and we talk a lot about the strategy all season long. But when you talk about the highest salary players on the slate in Cup and Taylor, a score like 2.2x is fantastic for
Yeah.
cash. You should basically play the top salary players. They're going to get 2 to 2.5x every single time. And this is just one of those situations where in tournaments, having them probably killed you. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting. Uh, just a great differentiator in the two big games.
Yeah, and surprisingly, Jonathan Taylor, he ended up in 35% of cash game lineups. I didn't think that many lineups would do that on DraftKings. And then Trey Lance, 67% of lineups. So obviously he was going to be a very popular quarterback there, but that's crazy high for a quarterback. We usually see those numbers on value running backs and value wide receivers. And then I think everything else kind of went as planned in terms of ownership. Another one that really, like, teams that put in the Bears defense with David Montgomery smash. Bears get 21 points at basically the same ownership as the Colts defense, who only get 6 points. So teams that end up with the Bears there end up having really good weeks too.
Yeah, they win.
Yeah,
The Giants are a joke.
Yeah, that
Sorry.
was the stats on that game yesterday, and especially their pass game were absolutely bonkers. Probably should have been a little heavier on the Bears, but those are good notes to keep in the back of our mind. I mean, we still got a few weeks left, but before we get into that, anything that really stood out to you yesterday? I know we only have a week of the regular season left, but anything stands out? NFL, DFS, general fantasy.
Yeah, we still got it. We still got a week 18 main slate to absolutely destroy here. So let's talk about it. I mean, the big one for me is Seattle over Detroit. Obviously, they move up to like 8.5-point favorites by the time that game kicks off, but it feels like they got their frustrations out against Detroit, scoring 51 points. DK goes absolutely nuclear. It really just refreshing to see that offense do that again. I really like the fact that Trey Lance didn't just run, but he introduced a vertical element to the San Francisco 49ers offense, throwing deep much, much more than Jimmy Garoppolo does. Let me tell you how good for fantasy it will be if you're throwing deep more often for George Kittle and Deebo Samuel and running more. I mean, next season I'm going to have so much Trey Lance. And nothing weird happened in the New York Jets Tampa Bay game. Nothing to report.
Dude, I mean, we always see crazy stuff, but like that was one of the most nuts things I've ever seen in a game, and that one's gonna live for quite a while.
That was the bong rip of the NFL season. Like, what the heck? Like, the Adam Schefter tweets coming in, because I was watching Red Zone, so I didn't have the game live in front of me, and I'm getting the tweets, and I'm like, what's going on? And then the footage was even crazier. I genuinely hope the guy is getting the help he needs, but from a DFS and a entertainment on my television standpoint, I have never seen anything like it.
Yeah, it was a crazy Sunday. Last show of the year. Any last thoughts going into the last week of the regular season, heading into the playoffs? I mean, the reason we cut this show out going into the last week is just because I don't think you should be playing a ton of cash games in playoffs, so that's why we're just not going to be reviewing it. But any just general thoughts going into playoffs or the last week of the season?
Yeah, so actually I do. This is a little bit nerdy, and I'm not sure this applies to absolutely everyone who's using our value metric. But if you are able to optimize by our value metric, whether you have some sort of your own tool, there are definitely ways to do it out there for you. If you are optimizing by our value metric, I am actually suggesting not to grind every little bit of value out of your lineup. Yeah. Go for the top 3 or 4 players and try to get the most value out of those core points, those anchor points, and then make sure you just hit some sort of value threshold. That's usually right around 50 points on a FanDuel lineup, 50 points in our value metric. So if you are using that process to build out your lineup and you're adding up the value points, try to hit about 50, but make sure you're adding up your top 3 or 4 players, most important players, and get the most out of that group first and foremost.
No, that's a really good really good point. And if you are trying to like grind too much value, like we still care about ceiling and cash games, right? So if you do plan on continue to play throughout the playoffs, like you still need those players that can break the slate a little bit. So like a Jonathan Taylor, who might not be popping as a crazy good value on DraftKings or something like that, if you could get him in around other really good values, that's often going to be a very good build. Just back to my point about like going into the playoffs and why we're not doing cash game reviews through the playoffs is just on these shorter slates. There's just like we already see like on DraftKings there's so much overlap when it comes to builds and these obvious builds, and we want to like make people prove it. When we're playing 2-game slates or 3-game slates, like there's just less. There's less mistakes for people to make. There's only so many players you could be playing. So I just tend to play more GPPs. I think if you're, it actually kind of, I don't play Showdown, but I think it actually makes more sense if you're going to play cash games to play Showdowns on these super small slates, because at least it's a game that's built around the idea of a very small slate, right? They have these captain or MVP pricing, salaries are different, so there is a difference. Whereas if you're just playing a classic DFS slate with these normal salaries, it just does, like, you could throw a lineup in a 50-50 or something, or even throw your tournament lineups in to like hedge a little bit. But I just don't think it makes a ton of sense to be playing a ton of cash games on these 2 or 3 game slates. But I do think it's important, like, we do these big overviews, and you talked about someone like Devin Singletary who's kind of trending in the right direction. Even though most people are done with fantasy this week, if you're playing DFS, paying attention to these trends going into the playoffs is going to be very important, because I do think there is an edge in these smaller slates, and we will be working on those slates content wise. So I think there's still some DFS meat on the bone here for us these last few weeks.
Absolutely. And go and check our from the DFS MVP. We definitely had a theory segment about small slates. So if you want to learn how to tackle that, we got you covered.
Yeah, and that will be in all of the intros for all of these slates coming up. Any last cash game thoughts for the year?
Hey, it's been a joy doing these shows. If you have no process for reviewing your cash games and learning how to get better, I cannot recommend this process enough. It was really scary to do this in front of people, but I'm very, very grateful we did.
Yeah, the accountability was great, and probably not a coincidence that I've had one of my better cash game years in recent history. Like
Me too, man.
The industry has definitely gotten sharper, but there's definitely still an edge. So we were able to have a pretty profitable year, and I'm always obviously excited about that. Hope the subscribers and the listeners did as well. Still got regular shows at least through week 18. So we'll be back to the normal time, DFS MVP this Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern time on YouTube. One more Yahoo DFS value show that'll be coming out on Saturday, both the DFS MVP and the Yahoo feed with Yahoo's Matt Harmon, and GPP Last Look show, subscriber only Discord, 11 a.m. Eastern time. Make sure you get signed up for that if you haven't yet. If you're thinking about dipping your toes in the DFS water, if you want to take all of that money you won from your championship this week and throw it into a little DFS, we are going through the Super Bowl. There are still quite a few slates, and the price is only $14 for the rest of the season. So, less than a millionaire buy-in. Get used to the 4for4 projections and site and our values, and hopefully we can help you make you some money throughout the playoffs. And if you want a little more from us, follow us on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4 football. Matt's at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Friday.